The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host, assisted ably today by my co-host, Toto. We're going to be introducing you to Omi, book 3 of the Afterlife Interrupted series. His name is spelled O-M-I, Omi. We call him Omi, the child soldier, the friend you hadn't met until now. The process that my prayer partners and I do, we do that by way of a trilogy. We first do one show that just tells the basic story of the person that we were invited to assist. Then we come back with a second podcast about compassionate response to that person's story. And then finally, a spiritual practice that somehow emerges from that person's story. So today, I'm going to be introducing you to Omi, the child soldier. He first came to me delivered in a dream on the night of February 13th, 2021. About a month later, about 5 weeks later, I was able to get with one of my prayer partners and go into his story. But so I'm asleep in February of 2021. And here's the dream as I saw it and wrote it in my journal. I was a child soldier with what seemed like 4 rifles. I was pointing them out of a slit in a window at a woman opposite me. I could have easily killed her. She looked my way, but she didn't look like an enemy soldier. She just looked like a school teacher or a businesswoman. She told me to put the gun down, and I obeyed her. I awoke. Well, um, in this story, we went into prayers. We always do. We do protected prayer with the angels and saints. I always start with Saint Michael the Archangel and with Mary, the Mother of Jesus, and Saint Dominic, the patron of the Dominican order to which I belong. Many others, Saint Benedict, Saint Mary Magdalene, Saint Maximilian Kolbe, and Padre Pio, sometimes Faustina, uh, Andrew. There are a great many of the holy ones who I consider spirit friends. Ask them to surround us and keep us safe from any kind of interference. So what we did our protective prayer, and very often I'll ask for the guardian of the person who brought the dream, if they wouldn't mind speaking first to give us a little clarity, as dreams of their nature have some symbology or some lack of clarity. So we did that, and uh, a guardian named Najif came in, Najif. He told us that the one that he guarded lived in a place of violence where people did the best they could to try to go about their daily lives in a war zone. The young man, Omi, was only 10 years old and he was at school. He enjoyed school very much and he admired school teachers and the adults that he met through his schooling. And but he told us of a day that other young men who were in a militia stormed his school and hauled off everybody, all the boys who were 10 or older. I think it was an all boys school to begin with. They wouldn't have educated young men and women in the same classroom. But anyway, he was abruptly kidnapped from his school and never saw his parents again. Uh, he felt like his entire childhood was just ripped away, and he was forced to be a soldier uh, from that day on. He didn't take to it very well at all, but he tried to cooperate, I suppose. He noticed that other young men just accepted that this was the new order of things and maybe applied themselves more to the training that these older soldiers were maybe only 5 to 7 years older than Omi was. Um, he said they'd already all the young men who were 20 or thereabouts who might have been more proper soldiers had long since been enlisted or conscripted into militias a formal military. But he had no choice. He became a child soldier. He told us that the day that he showed the dream that he showed us, he was observed. He was pointing a rifle out a window, and he was supposed to kill uh, somebody. And the person that he saw was a woman who looked at him and said, "Put that down." And he just thought, she sounds like a teacher or a businesswoman. She sounds like some woman who's authoritative and reasonable. And there's no reason that I should kill her. She's not an enemy combatant. She's just some woman trying to go about her business. So when she told him, "This is not who you are, put that down," he obeyed the woman and said, "I wasn't in charge of very much, but I was at least in charge of whether or not I pulled a trigger." Well, for not pulling the trigger, he got in trouble with the other young guys in this militia that were trying to form him into a soldier. He said that they gave me all the worst jobs after that, the worst food, all the nastiest chores. Um, if ever you cried, they'd make a big deal of it that you were a crybaby. He said, "I wasn't crying because I was a baby. I was crying because I was lonely and frightened and hungry, and I missed my family and the life that I'd had ripped away from me." He also told us that he was around so many flying bullets that when he finally got hit by one, it didn't come as too much of a surprise. He also could very matter of factly say, "The bullet that hit me did its job very quickly. It hit a part of me that caused my death quickly, and he didn't suffer." Still, it's extraordinary. I've never met a child soldier before meeting Omi in this forum, but really heartbreaking to. I mean, we know that lots of children are growing up in war zones or places where there's a great deal of violence or struggle of different kinds. But anyway, that's who we have today, who we're meeting, Omi. Uh, he was in our line because the help that he needed after his sudden and violent death, he had already received and benefited by. If you're familiar with our process, uh, it's called our line, and people are directed our way or choose to come and take part in the process that we do when they no longer need this therapeutic afterlife level that seems to be set up for people that, like him, were shot to death and who needed different kinds of help than someone who might have died in peacetime. Anyway, he explained to us that he had gotten all the help that he needed, and he was told that it was time for him to advance to a next level. Um, and he had told us how much he had been enjoying being 10 years old. And uh, he said, "I'm not exactly that anymore because I've had experiences since that day that have added to who I was." But he said, I really hope that I can have back some of what was taken from me in the childhood." Well, we were in the middle of talking with him, but we felt like we were getting near the point where we often have to encourage them to think of who they'd like to have come for them. And he said, "I don't need to do that. There's a man already here." I can feel his presence now. That man was an alum of this process, uh, Nadi, who was also an Iraqi, and now I consider him a friend. Nadi, if you recall from I think book two, he had been uh, a man of prayer, a family man, and his mosque had been bombed by what he called the other kind of Muslim. He said, "My prayers offended them, and they had bombed his mosque. They had no proper imam, like a pastor, to lead that congregation any longer. But he was a businessman, and he and a few others got together to find some substitute place where they could continue to gather to pray. And they had found something that was, I think, a former warehouse, so it was rather windowless, which was helpful in a war zone. Um, and he had been at prayer with the other men, and their women, their wives and daughters, were across an alley in another space that they had procured, rented, I think. When gunfire, they could hear gunfire outside. Nadi had to make the decision to go out to see about the safety of the women and girls. He got into the alley and saw a lot of people bleeding. And then to his right, he saw a 10-year-old girl with two men standing over her with guns pointed at her head. They had given her a machine gun and told her that she needed to fire it and kill Nadi, or they would kill her and her mother. Just awful. But anyway, Nadi had long since been through this and had been through this process. Well, he showed up for Omi. He said, he's my countryman, and I feel like I could give him the help that he needs. So it was one person who tried to live a peaceful life in a war zone, helping another. Of course, in the next two parts of this trilogy, we'll have more to tell you. But one of the things that it was clear was when we first were meeting Omi, yes, it was true that his life ended when he was about 10, but he said, I've matured some in the afterlife. And even his language, the way he formed his thoughts, didn't suggest a 10-year-old. I suppose anybody growing up in a war zone might have to grow up quickly, but he just had a composure and a kind of sense of bearing about him. Well, he did tell us after it was clear that he was about to make a passage that he had been told um, that whatever this passage would be, he wouldn't have to leave childhood behind completely. Remember, he had no choice in having his childhood taken from him, and he really valued the things that he was experiencing as a child. So they let him know that when he made this crossing, this passage, transition, upward movement, however you want to think of it, that he would be allowed to seek out a place where he could not exactly resume his um, 10-year-old life, but that the parts of it that he found so precious and engaging, they could those could be kind of recreated, reconstituted for him. So part of the reason that we included his story because in this particular book three, remember we subtitled it "Please Let Me Explain," and we thought that this story had that element in it uh, was interesting to note and maybe could help you think a new thought about what your own afterlife might be or the afterlife of people that you love. That it appears that if his story is true, that we don't have to leave behind parts of our life if they were taken from us. Um, I've known some people who uh, were sexually or otherwise abused in childhood and who felt like uh, they had to kind of fake their way through it. They had to look normal, but didn't exactly know what normal was because their own life was not normal. Who, after their passing, have chosen to go back and live the early part of their life without that abuse, without that negativity, whatever it was. So that might be a different way of thinking of things too, that um, the joys of heaven for some, they might be um, ordinary joys, that they might be things that we who lived in peace and in wholesome, happy families uh, might have taken for granted that look really attractive to someone who didn't get to have that and and who might want the afterlife equivalent of it. I think that's interesting. Anyway, Nadi explained to us that he would take it from here and he would accompany young Omi, and that's all it was to it. So the first of these three parts of these trilogies typically go shorter because it's just explaining the basic outline. Even at that, if you should take up book three and read it yourself, it has a little more detail than I ended up describing here in this podcast. But next time, we'll go into history in greater detail, and we'll particularly look at it with regard to compassionate response of trying to, well, first off, for any who have given me feedback about this story and how it affected them, we can use that. And then compassion just means to suffer with. I try to go back into the story and pray through it and think, what can this story, entering into it with a compassionate heart, what can it do for us? And how can it make us better people, better servants of those with whom we share the earth right now? Certainly, we can continue to pray for children who are in harm's way, in war zones and in any place where they're unsafe. But for now, Toto and I want to say goodbye to you, don't you? So we are grateful that you joined us today and hope that you'll join us next time for part two of this trilogy, which will be Omi, Child, Soldier, Compassionate Response. But for now, remember that I'm praying for you, and I'm grateful for your interest in our podcast. God bless you. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.